Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Busboys and Poets Books Presents, a book talk series that we do here at Busboys and Poets. My name is Lori. I'm the Director of Operations for Busboys and Poets Books, and my pronouns are they, them. I am so excited I always say that, but I really truly am excited for tonight's author and the book in question. Today, we are featuring Refugee High, Coming of Age in America, which is the brainchild of Elly Fishman, who spent just about 2 years with well, you're going to learn about this, but with students of various backgrounds, many of whom came to the United States as refugees in Chicago proper. And so I'm going to stop rambling because obviously I won't be able to paint the beautiful, empathetic, and just heart-wrenching and also heartwarming portrait that Elly does. We're going to start with Elly Fishman doing a live reading, and she's going to be joined by Washington Post reporter Kim Bellware. And so I'm very excited to welcome Elly. Hey, Elly.
Hi. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me. So I thought I would start with a short reading from the book, which is here, Refugee High, and a fun kind of insight about the cover, which you can see here, and behind me, I'm messing up my pointing, the mirror is screwing me up, but this is actually, so Sullivan is a school in Chicago where students come from 40 different countries. They speak over 35 different languages, and these translations here are, I'm trying to avoid the reflection, are actually many of the languages spoken at Sullivan, and they are written by the kids themselves. So I always like to point that out because it's a nice kind of homage to the kids in the book and the school. So Refugee High is 1 year inside Roger C. Sullivan High School, which is on the north side of Chicago in one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse neighborhood in the city. And I follow 4 students over the course of the school year, one from Iraq, another from the Congo, a young man from Guatemala City, and a young woman from Yangon, Myanmar. And the first chapter is the first day of school. So you meet these students as they begin their journeys at Sullivan, whether it's their first year in the building or just the first day of the current school year. So this is Shahina, a sophomore from Myanmar, on her first day of her sophomore year at Sullivan. Every morning on her way to Sullivan High School, Shahina passes reminders of the life she narrowly escaped. That's why she counts down the days until she turns 18. She still has 408 days to go, but that's close enough to keep the Burmese sophomore in good spirits. Though the way to school conjures bitter memories, Shahina, a refugee from Myanmar, is always relieved to be out of the house. Tensions are high at home. Shahina and her mother rarely speak, and when they do, Zakia curses her daughter's obstinacy, and school offers distraction. Inside Sullivan, Shahina walks past quotes painted next to each classroom. Maya Lin's "The American Dream is being able to follow your calling," and one from Dr. Seuss, "Think left and think right and think low and think high. Oh, the things you can think up if only you try." The school is a sea of navy blue lockers with the bright yellow S, Sullivan's insignia, painted above them. Below, the drab black and brown checkered floors seem to dampen the optimism advertised on the walls. The deteriorating first floor girls' bathroom, marked by large concrete slabs and rusting water pipes, stands among Shahina's most cherished spaces inside Sullivan. It's there, in the fetid room, that the 16-year-old will station herself near the mirror and take dozens of hijabless selfies. She'll spend hours each day posting photos enhanced by kitten ear filters to Snapchat, uploading close-up, doe-eyed portraits to Instagram, and keeping up with ongoing flirtations with a slew of Burmese boys on Facebook Messenger. Recently, she's been talking to a Rohingya boy in Boston who claims he carries a gun and runs with a crew called the Asian Boys Gang. His profile picture boasts the group's logo, their name with a lightning bolt for a Z. Though she's never been particularly interested in school, Shahina looks forward to starting her sophomore year at Sullivan. At school, she can watch YouTube tutorials on sunset makeup looks and catch up on social media gossip. She can make plans to watch scary movies and hitch a ride to the mall. She can drink Diet Coke and eat soggy pizza. Ever since Shahina, who cloaks her thin frame with loose clothing, began fighting with her mother, the girl refuses to eat at home. Most days, the meals provided at school are the only ones she eats. At Sullivan, Shahina can be a kid. 6 months ago, the teenager thought she'd never get that chance again. So that's Shahina on her first day of her sophomore year at Sullivan. Hi, Kim.
Hi, Ellie. Are we, I guess, ready to start our chat?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, for everybody who's tuning in, this is really exciting for me because I got to hear a little bit about how this book was coming together. I'm a reporter for the Washington Post, but I live in Chicago, and I'm familiar with this neighborhood and this high school. But, for those of us to just kind of set the scene a little bit, I know you said that it's in Rogers Park on the north side, and it's one of the kind of most diverse areas. But what's kind of the 30,000-foot view of, a place like Rogers Park? Why is this really diverse population, kind of convening on Sullivan in particular?
Yeah, well, Rogers Park is definitely one of my favorite parts of Chicago. And I also feel like whenever I travel to any city, I'm looking for the Rogers Park of that place. So you probably know what it is in DC, but it's been a long time hub for immigrant and refugee life and first generation life. One of the main thoroughfares of the neighborhood is this street called Devon Avenue, where it feels like you can absolutely travel the globe through food and fashion and music just by walking up and down the streets. There's a huge Pakistani population, an Indian population, there's an Orthodox Jewish population, there's an increasing Burmese population. It's just incredibly diverse and really so vibrant. And Rogers Park is like that in general as a neighborhood. And Sullivan is the neighborhood high school, or one of the neighborhood high schools in the area. So that means when new immigrants or refugee families arrive in the neighborhood and are resettled there, if they have high school age kids, Sullivan is their neighborhood school. So that's how Sullivan, for really since its opening, became a place, a landing place for immigrant and refugee young people.
One of the things that kind of struck me was, in a city like Chicago, also in a city like DC, there is a lot of pride in the diverse population, in all of the different cultures and experiences. And I remember being really struck when reading about the story of, is it Belenge? Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Belenge, one of the students who is originally from Congo, one of the things that just kind of seemed to be really, lost on him or hard for him to get his arms around is just the whole dynamic of what Blackness is in America and is in a city like Chicago, because he didn't, he saw himself as Congolese, and to everybody else, they just saw him as, Black American. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess what I'm getting at with this question, kind of a clumsy way, is, diversity seems like it can be really, really a supportive environment when we have, if we want to be a welcoming community, we have new immigrants. But what were some of these smaller, kind of details and experiences that these students were dealing with that can't just be bundled up in, if we have a diverse population, everything will work out? What are like the intentional things that some of these students needed, support with?
Yeah, well, I guess first, maybe I'll just explain who the 4 students are that I follow in the book, because this is such an intimate lens on these individual kids' experiences. And so much of what I observed and so much of what sits at the heart of the book really grows from those observations. And of course, these kids each have their own individual experiences, but they reflect many young people's experiences in a lot of ways too. So as I started with today, Shahina is a sophomore from Myanmar, and over the course of the book, really what I unpack and what you follow as a reader is her fierce struggle with her mother's kind of traditional expectations for her, particularly around marriage, and Shahina's own desire for autonomy and independence and life as kind of an independent American Burmese woman. And she's really fighting for that in her own way. Then Belenge, who you mentioned, is from the Congo, although he, like many Congolese refugees, was born in a sprawling refugee camp in Tanzania near Agusu, which is 150,000 people, probably more at this point. So really, it's like a city in and of itself. So he's never actually been to the Congo. He's born as a stateless citizen. And his father, Tobias, who you also meet in the book, by the time they leave to arrive in the US, he had spent close to 20 years, actually 20 years exactly in the refugee camp. And that's not uncommon. The average time a family might spend in a camp is 17 years, which is a pretty remarkable data point to encounter. And then there's Mariah, who's a sophomore from Iraq, who's, all of her sisters have been married or are engaged, and she's 15, and she's kind of aware of the path carved for her and really interested in finding a different one. And then there's Alejandro, who's actually an asylum seeker from Guatemala City, whose second and final plea for asylum is set for 3 days before he's supposed to graduate from high school. So that's hanging over their head. So with each of these kids, young people, and certainly now they're not kids anymore. I started reporting the book in 2017. They're all dealing with their own challenges. And as you mentioned with Belenge, so one of the kind of dramatic tensions and challenges of his year inside Sullivan that I chronicle is that one of his friends gets shot quite early on, another Congolese refugee. They believe it's by one of his American classmates in a gang recruitment gone awry, basically. And there's so much that's lost in translation, literally, because these kids don't really have a great command of English. They also don't really understand culturally what's going on. And as you mentioned, they're often kind of coded on the street as Black American, but they don't at all identify as Black American. In many ways, Black Americans feel as foreign as anyone to them. So that's part of the tension in the book, and it's the kinds of things that echo throughout Sullivan. And that's what makes it such an interesting place, because not only are there typical high school dynamics, but layered on top of that are all these different global experiences, global identities, and issues too.
Yeah, you were mentioning, losing some of the things in translation. I wanted to jump a little bit into some of your process. I know you spent a lot of time not only with the students and their families. You spent a lot of time in school. What was it like? I'll back up. What is it like being in a school like Sullivan when you have? It's about 40 languages that are spoken in those hallways. Just kind of, can you give readers and I guess the audience a little bit of, just a scene of kind of what that environment is like to step into it?
Yeah, well, stepping into that environment was what made me realize I wanted to write about Sullivan. When I started this project, I'd already been reporting in Chicago for many years and often reported about young people and spent a good amount of time in schools. But when I first visited Sullivan, and this was back in like February 2017, I walked in the doors and realized I had never encountered a school like this. Not only are there the actual languages, but there's so many other languages unfolding in front of you, like language of fashion and social media and music and movies, and just this incredible pluralistic place, not populist, pluralistic place that really was so different than any space I'd ever stepped into. And also what I realized was that these are teenagers. Without knowing it, I'd been holding an image of the refugee experience in my mind that I think reflected a lot of the images I was consuming as I read about refugees. So families fleeing on boats or crowded into refugee camps. But here in a high school, what I saw was a typical high school scene. And that was a really important moment for me, because I realized that, of course, this is part of the refugee experience and their settlement experience, and one that maybe was talked about less than other parts of the journey. And so that's why I dug into this story and really wanted to write about teenagers in particular. And so then I kind of went about trying to get to know the students, and really intentionally took my time and wanted to build trust first, and eventually identified these 4 students who I would follow for a year, kind of as their shadow, and continue to report for almost another 2 years, report on them for another 2 years.
How did you overcome the actual language barrier and some of the kind of cultural, maybe not barriers, but how did you just deal with the very basics of communication with students who, most of them all of them you were finding in Sarah Quintez's English language learner program. So they're not native English speakers. Can you talk a little bit about, what it was like to communicate with, folks who are still learning English, and then their families who might have even more, limited language ability?
Yeah, so one nickname that I give the school is the Google Translate School, because everything is always being filtered through Google Translate, whether it's a lesson plan in class or it's kids trying to flirt with each other, which is totally my favorite thing to see, some romantic music go in as Burmese and then come out, get translated into French and then come out into English or whatever. You can imagine.
We'll come back to that.
Yeah, there's some really, those are some great moments. But it was important to me to identify students who I could communicate with on a basic level without translators at school, because first of all, they're coming from such diverse places. I would have to have a fleet of translators with me at all times if I needed them. And that would be really overwhelming and kind of jarring in a school, and also honestly prohibitively expensive because I was in the school almost every day. But also I wanted to be able to communicate with them so I could explain to them the project. I could feel like they understood it, and encourage them to ask me questions, encourage them to feel like they had agency in the process. And that felt super important to me, and so I needed to be able to talk to them and converse with them. But with their families, it was a little different. I did use translators, many of whom were refugees or arrived as refugees themselves, and really incredible, special people. And I felt really lucky that I got to know these translators through my work, and they would accompany me to visit the kids' parents, and that's mostly how we would communicate.
What was it like, especially for some of these individuals they've gone through so much trauma, to them, you're, a stranger. How did you kind of, ingratiate yourself into their world, and how did you really earn their trust, especially when, they have just so much that they're dealing with? Why would they let, a stranger hang around their family and ask questions and kind of dig for sometimes difficult answers?
Yeah, well, I took it intentionally slowly, and that's a real benefit of working on a book is that you can take your time, which I mean, I'm sure you're in the newspaper world, you're always coming up against deadlines and that I worked in magazines for many years and those feel luxurious, those deadlines compared to newspaper ones. But then a book, I mean, you just have so much more space to spread out and kind of take your time. And so I really took things slowly with the students, and I also emphasized getting to know them that day, who they were at Sullivan, what they were thinking about, um, what TV shows they were watching, what music they were listening to, really just trying to build some kinship and trust on a day-to-day basis with them, and also just kind of showing up every day so they get used to you. That's a huge that makes a huge difference. And then with their families, I wasn't sure what to expect, to be honest. You never really know, and these families have been through so much, and they all carry trauma and many layers of burdens, and um in a couple cases I was told don't expect anything. I would bring a translator and think, well, maybe I'll have 5 minutes and then we'll go home, because I didn't want to push anyone to share beyond what they were comfortable with. But I was really moved and surprised by how open their families were. And I would show up and be greeted by an incredible spread of food, like an incredible feast, enough for like 20 people. And they would say, "Oh, we thought your husband was coming," but like my husband is a good eater. But this was enough food for an extended family, and we'd sit down and spend hours with them, and they would share their lives with me. And I felt so lucky and privileged that I was able to sit there and listen and use this platform that I have to help amplify those stories. And those are moments that really surprised me and that I'll always carry with me, because it was not necessarily what I ever expected.
A lot of times in reporting, especially, I know most recently doing a story that's not out yet, that it also involves high schoolers. They just kind of need to sniff you out. And I think this is true of kids no matter where in the world they're from, just teenagers. They want to be able to, kind of kick the tires on a reporter a little bit, and, they might ask questions that, for people our age, we just think are like kind of funny and nosy. And, did those students have those? What kind of questions did they have for you? What did they need to know about you or about what you were doing to kind of build that trust and feel comfortable opening up to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because definitely if kids are like not interested in talking to you, teenagers, it's really clear right away. They're just like they give you the cold shoulder and that's that. But for the students who were interested, they kind of wanted to know the same types of things that I would end up asking them, like where was I from? What was my family like? They wanted to know about being a writer. A lot of the young women wanted to know about being a woman in America and what, going to college and how I thought about my career, and did I date before I got married? All these things that we I felt like I took for granted. Like, yeah, of course I dated my husband for many years before we got married, but that was something they would often want to talk about, and something that they were realizing in many cases they wanted for themselves, but kind of broke with family tradition. So that would come up a lot. And also just asking about like what movies I liked, what music I liked. And I feel like part of building trust was just giving them space to share the things that they were excited about, the things that they were worried about, just giving them a chance to voice their opinions and really listen seemed to go a long way.
Was there ever any pressure to feel like you had to give the best possible answer of like what this is, when asking questions about America, did you feel like I really got to get this right?
Yeah, and I'm sure I screwed it up all the time. They would also ask me, I'm Jewish, and many of them hadn't met a Jew before, so they'd ask me a lot of questions about Judaism, and I was like, I'm definitely going to get something wrong here because, and I had definitely, one of the things they asked me a lot, because I wear a lot of black, and many of them live near an Orthodox Jewish population, is like, do all Jews wear all black? So that one I could confidently say, no, we don't. This just happens to be a fashion choice of mine. But they would also ask me lots of other questions, and some I felt better equipped to answer than others.
It's so funny because some of what, you describe in the book, which I mean, I love the most of these really just kind of tender moments of the things that feel really universal, how they are getting ready and like styling their hair just so for that first day of school, picking out their clothes, social media, fighting with their parents, trying to keep a good relationship with that teacher at school that they like, even though they might not be doing everything that teacher wants them to do. That felt so universal. Do they share with you what some of their, as far as their impressions of school in America was like? Did they have a sense that they were at a school that is not like every school?
Yeah, I think they did. Refugee families, especially with social media, they are in touch with one another. And so, the first thing these kids do when they arrive is they go get a SIM card. So they're not only in touch with people here, wherever they land, whether it's Chicago or DC or Denver or anywhere in the country, but they're also in touch with their families back home and their friends and family who have ended up elsewhere. And so they're very aware of how their universe looks compared to others. And I think that can a lot of times be really heavy for kids because they recognize that in some ways they kind of won the lottery. I mean, they'll talk about it that way. They were the ones that got to come to the US. And that was not the case for many of their friends and family. And then on a more localized level, I think for so many of them, they walk into an American school, and this would be true in any city across the country, and it doesn't look like any place they've ever been. I mean, of course, some refugees have completed high school and college and are really highly educated by the time they get here, while others really have never had any formalized school at all. But no matter what, I mean, just going into new school is overwhelming, of course. And I think I would often hear that they would expect to be the only Arabic speaker in their school, or the only Swahili speaker. And then immediately when they walk in the doors, they hear and see what I saw, which is this kind of pastiche quilt of languages, and realize, oh, I'm not alone here. And that is an immediate comfort for them.
I'm thinking too of all the pressures that they're dealing with as being refugees, being immigrants, being teenagers. There's a lot happening, and then I'm thinking also, the school year in which you focused on in your reporting, which was 2017 to 2018. Going back, rewinding, and remember what was happening in the country at the time. January 2017, that started with former President Trump's, so-called Muslim ban. Following, months focused on a lot of strikes against family reunification, targeting specific countries. By the following year, later in September, there's the lowering of the refugee cap down to 45,000, which was, I think, maybe the lowest ever for resettlement. And then, some really disparaging remarks. I think January 2018, we got the shithole countries remarks. And this was, there was a lot of really anti-refugee rhetoric going on, all, while these students are trying to just deal with, their everyday lives. What was there? Did they talk to you about that? Did they reflect back to you kind of what they were picking up from, Trump's messaging and from kind of the larger political discourse around refugees?
It's interesting because I expected more of that. because I was so aware of it. And that's kind of what brought me to the question of who are the refugees in Chicago to begin with, this anti-refugee, anti-immigrant rhetoric coming from the highest office. But like you said, they are also just teenagers. And actually what teenagers are thinking about is the bullying at school, the person they have a crush on, what they're going to wear tomorrow. And so in many cases, they really didn't bring up that national rhetoric with me. And I kind of kept waiting for them to talk about it. And they didn't. I mean, you would hear it sometimes, and certainly the teachers and staff were aware of it, but that really didn't seem to be what these kids thought about. And I think part of that is also they are used to living with rhetoric that targets them, whether it's because of their religion or their ethnicity or their nationality. And maybe, I mean, I can't confirm this, but I would often wonder if that, what they were hearing from Trump and the Trump administration didn't necessarily feel different than the kinds of things they had heard for much of their lives or recent lives.
There's a lot of individuals in the story. I know we have to focus on just a couple of them that I want to ask about later on, but I also want to zoom out a little bit and look at some of the current events, because it seems like so much of what you saw and learned about has a lot of applications to so many of the immigration questions. We were talking earlier, you and I were talking earlier today about how some of the refugees from Afghanistan are now being resettled in places like Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't know if there are any in DC, but this is something that will, the United States is always going to be a place that refugees want to come to. And, when they get into place, what does that system look like to support them and help them be successful? Can you talk a little bit about right now, and you can have me expand on it if you want, or you can expand on it, very specifically with what's happening with some of the refugees now from Afghanistan. What does that, you think, reveal about, where we need to pay closer attention to, problems in our resettlement system?
Well, it's so interesting because I started reporting this book in 2017, as we've mentioned, and then I read my final draft of the book about a year ago, a little under a year ago. And in that time, there really, because of COVID, because of the Trump administration, the lowering of the cap of refugee resettlement, there really weren't refugees coming into the country. And the book came out August 10th. And about a week later, the news of Afghanistan broke. And that was this kind of chaotic moment of getting people out, right? And so suddenly refugees were in the news again in a totally unexpected way. And not only that, but the new school year was starting and kids were coming back to physical schools after having been gone for close to 18 months at that point. And I was thinking, wow, what are the kinds of things that we can learn from a place like Sullivan as these two moments are colliding? And I mean, actually, so with Afghanistan refugees, or Afghan refugees, they're only really now starting to resettle in communities. I mean, I'm sure as many of you know, they have been held up in these military bases, waiting to be resettled in DC, in Chicago, all over the country. And it's just been incredibly delayed for a variety of reasons, but one of which is that these resettlement agencies were just totally gutted under the Trump administration and don't have the infrastructure or the budget or the staff to manage the resettlement. And also it was just a really chaotic moment. And So now that they're arriving and we're seeing this unfold, you're realizing how much needs to be rebuilt after the Trump administration. And not only does that mean, they need resettlement agencies need money, of course, but they need folks who speak a variety of languages, Pashto, Dara, so many of the languages in Afghanistan. They need to find housing. They need to help. A lot of these Afghan refugees are arriving without some of the typical refugee protection, so they don't necessarily qualify for federal assistance when they first get here. So they need a lot of help. And there is this amazing movement across the country of people rising up to want to help Afghans. But, they're also something that I'm learning is they're really big families. So these families might be 13 or 15 people. And if they arrive in a place like DC or Chicago, you have to find an apartment for them. And that's not an easy thing for a family who arrives with basically nothing in their pockets. So I guess there are a lot of like specific things we could point to, but right now it's also just like finding them a place to land and figuring out how to set them up to even start their lives here. And that's taking a lot longer than I think a lot of people anticipated.
I always remember there was, these communities, like the people you were talking about in the movements that wanted to step up and help refugees. And, we've seen that around the country, people that want to gather materials and help furnish an apartment, things like that. Were there anything in particular that the students ever told you that was somewhat common, or, even if it wasn't a commonality, because I know they all have somewhat different experiences, but, were there things that they mentioned would have been helpful, something that is, maybe would have been somewhat easy to do to make their entry a little smoother?
Well, sometimes it's the stuff that you don't even realize, like knowing how to get on a bus and get to school, or knowing how to read an address on a building, because that's not necessarily intuitive depending on where you come from. So having someone there as kind of on the ground right away, just to walk you through kind of basic day-to-day needs. So here's how the city's laid out. Here's how you find an address. Here's how you get on the bus. That kind of stuff makes a huge difference. Having access to translation lines. So whether it's at a doctor or the bank or a job application or school, that makes a huge difference.
Like a phone line, like a number that, like a hotline they could call to do real-time translation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And then this is more long-term and big picture, but mental health services. And that is huge, and it's layered and it's complicated because not only do you want mental health services to be available, but also, many refugees are coming from communities where that's not necessarily a conversation that they have at home. What trauma is, what PTSD is. It's not necessarily a language that they even understand. And it's something that the kids start to learn at Sullivan. And that's actually something that Sullivan does really remarkably well, is they understand their role as a place to provide mental health services, and think about that kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So shelter and safety and community and health. And the more we can do that for these new families, the better.
We're starting to get some questions coming in, and we're definitely going to get to those. I want to ask Elly a couple more questions, then we'll get some. So please keep sending those in if you have them. And if we get a lot, then I will cut myself off a little sooner. But, there's the question of the immigration system in the U.S. And something else, though, is public schools. I mean, Sullivan is a public high school, and I was so interested in seeing how the public school infrastructure kind of contributes to what the experiences that these kids have. You mentioned trauma, And, there's a little bit where Chad Adams, Sullivan's principal, was kind of looking at different ways to handle things that any high school has to deal with, which is things like security and things like, how are we going to, are we going to be a punitive school? Are we going to be a restorative justice school? And I'm just wondering, kind of thinking through this exactly how I want to ask, but, what ways could public education, in seeing how the school system was for these refugee students, are there things that you think public schools could change that would benefit all students? I mean, you saw these through Sullivan, but I was really fixated on the food at school and security. But what about just kind of where we invest in public school? You think how would that have benefited the students if different choices have been made?
Yeah, it's a big question, but I think the things that Sullivan does really well, and in particular, Chad Adams, who you mentioned, is the principal and is a very savvy principal, does really well, is he understands that a school, a neighborhood school, a public school, really any school, is part of a larger ecosystem. It sits in a neighborhood. It should be a place that connects with its neighbors. It should be a space that opens up to the community, brings the community in. I mean, there are so many programs that come to Sullivan, and all they need is a space, from Parent University, which is continuing education, to something like BAM, with Becoming a Man, which is these kind of healing therapy circles for young men, to a health clinic, an access health clinic for students and even their families if they need it. He sees and really understands that a school, in order to serve its community and in order to thrive, needs not only to support its neighborhood, but needs to be supported by its neighborhood. And I think that's a really important thing to think about when it comes to schools in general. They're not only a place for curricular learning, but they might also be the main sports attraction of a neighborhood, or the only place that a family goes to see live music, or the only place where they go to get counseling, or where they get a free meal, or even three. And schools, it's so important for schools to think about that, but that's also a huge burden on any individual school. So I think in terms of funding, or in thinking about how to bolster schools, we have to think about how can we support them in that way, and not necessarily only tie dollars to these traditional metrics of like test scores or the number of bodies in the building. You kind of have to look at the school in a more holistic way, and the roles it plays for its students and its families and its neighbors.
It's so interesting because that kind of makes me reflect a lot on the 21st century school model that I think had been attempted under the Obama administration to make these schools hubs. And, there was, I think, limited patience and willingness to fund that. But, for a lot of it brought in what you were talking about. So thank you for that. I want to get to some of these questions because these are very good, and I want to make sure that people get the answers from you that they would like to hear. And this is one that I'm curious about as well. So thank you for whoever asked this. But when you spoke to the students, did any uncomfortable or difficult topics come up?
Yeah, a lot. And many of them are in the book. So I guess I should say that I did give all the students pseudonyms because I wanted to give them the option of whether they wanted to identify themselves and, when the book came out. But I also made that decision quite early on and told them that. I also told them, I don't want to shy away from anything hard, but if you get uncomfortable, raise a hand and we'll pause at any time. So if you look at the transcripts of my interviews, I also try and kind of stop every 15, 20 minutes and remind them of that, especially if hard topics come up. But there's a lot of really, really tough stuff comes up, and much of it is in the book. And Kim knows this too, as a reporter, especially when you're reporting on marginalized groups or groups of young people, or really anyone who's been through, has seen the world and at its worst. you bear witness to some really difficult stuff, and you carry that with you. I certainly carry that with me. So with Shahina, I'll just give one example. The young woman I read about at the top of the hour, her mother basically tricked her, forced her into an arranged marriage at age 15, and walking through that, and Shahina actually ends up basically clawing her way out of it, and walking through that experience with her was incredibly difficult, incredibly difficult. And a lot of conversations like that would come up. And also because I think for a lot of these teens, and maybe in particular the young women, because I'm a woman, or just because their experience is different than young men, they often didn't necessarily have an outlet, like someone to share with. So you become that in a way, and that becomes part of your conversations with them. And you just sort of have to steel yourself for it and prep yourself for it. And then ask the question, which I always try and do, is like, okay, does this belong in the story, or is this something that will remain private? And I made different choices depending on the topics.
Yeah, it's always a tough decision because you're dealing with these really intimate moments from everybody. I was curious too, kind of as you were discussing that question, did you prep yourself in any particular way, either with, going deep on looking at kind of trauma-informed reporting, or even some of the, the cultures of the specific students once you'd sort of identified who you wanted to be the key characters of the book? Did you have any kind of prep or any sort of outside considerations, any counselors that you pulled in to kind of prepare you?
Yeah, I tried to. Yeah. Both other writers or other, people in the community, sometimes the translators or people I met through the work, who had a better familiarity with each of these cultures. And actually, once I wrote the book, I did have several different people read it too, for that same reason. So who, they could flag anything that, felt wrong or felt off. But I talked to a lot of other writers whose work I really admire, and whose kind of ethics and moral compass and I also really admire. And in times of need, they were the ones I called, and I felt really lucky that I could do that, because tough stuff comes up. Yeah, absolutely.
Since this is an event for a bookstore, I'll ask you for those writers' names at the end of this, so people can go read their work if they want.
Yeah, definitely.
And then I like this one a lot too, because so much of this book, I mean, I think reading the book, there is so much, beautiful detail, and there's a lot of heartbreaking stuff. And, do you see this book as a, I don't think it can be a binary of like, it's a happy book or a sad book, but, does that change in your mind when you think about how, their stories have played out?
Yeah, well, I wanted it to be a book that celebrated resilience, but with that comes, what the hardships are as well. But I never wanted to write a book that really only focused on the trauma that these kids experience, because that's not who I met at Sullivan. I met these kids who, yes, they have been through unimaginable journeys and continue to negotiate a lot of really difficult challenges, but they're also just teenagers in a way that felt really universal, learning K-pop songs and TikTok dances and buying candy at Walgreens. And there's so much that felt familiar to me. And like, even though I'm not a teenager anymore, I could feel, those experiences myself and recognize them too. And I wanted that to sit at the heart of the book as much as anything else, and show how we are the same, and how, these universal human experiences bind us to one another. And I did that because I think that makes us better neighbors and more empathetic people. And I certainly felt that way, having spent time with these kids and their families myself.
Yeah, I think it was such a strength of the book that, these kids are not defined by their trauma or the worst thing that happened to them. And so one of the audience members asked, what moments of joy did you experience that really stuck with you and stuck with your students?
So many. So I spent a lot of time in the book and in my reporting in the library, because it's kind of the central EL refugee immigrant hub of the school. And those are where like the most fun moments unfold, many of which emerge from music. So, kids would plug in their phones and queue up their favorite Turkish pop star or Tanzanian pop star and all start dancing and bring each other in and teach each other dances and goof around and film each other and prank each other. And that was always like super fun to see. Also, there's a chapter about a Thanksgiving.
I love that chapter.
Yeah, it's a really special night. All the kids, they bring their own dishes from home, and it's this incredible spread of food. You definitely read the book and you realize, oh, like Elly's very into food, because there's a lot
I'm
of
also very into food. So I notice when the students when Belenge doesn't like the food and breakfast, and when when the students don't want to eat, or when they do want to eat, which is the stuff that they bring from home.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I am into food and I love trying to travel the globe through food, but there's so much food in there because it is really a way that these kids and their families share their culture. And they really like love sharing that with other people and love sharing that with me. So that's also why there's so much food in there. But the Thanksgiving feast is a really special night where, all these kids, they show up with these massive, beautiful dishes and get to talk about their mom's cooking and their family history. And moments like that were just so joyful and wonderful. And there are a lot of them.
The descriptions of that Thanksgiving make me want to really reconsider my Thanksgiving menu this year.
Totally. Yeah.
Another question, which I'm very curious if this comes either from the parent of a teenager or a teacher, was there anything that you hadn't anticipated with your students that later struck you as kind of like, oh, duh, or very obvious once you saw it? And, how do you think we as adults can kind of bypass this and be more proactive in learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, in some ways, that's where this whole project grew from. With the oh duh was like, oh duh, they're teenagers that want the same things that all teenagers want, in addition to being refugees, and remembering that that is true for these kids. And sometimes that doesn't come out right away because maybe they don't have a great command of English when they first arrive, or they're shy, or they're overwhelmed, but it comes out pretty quickly, and you realize there are all these universal desires that these kids have, and a lot of that plays out as they become kind of more involved in school life. So as they join the soccer team or the band, or anime club is huge at Sullivan. Anime is like the great unifier. And just remembering that that is a huge part of what they're experiencing, and holding that, close as a teacher, as a parent, as a reporter, as anyone who's kind of intersecting with these young people, I think is important.
I can't believe we only have a few minutes left, so I want to encourage people to keep sending in questions if they have them. So if you do have questions, I will get those in, but as we wait for any more, I wanted to briefly jump to some of the adults that you spent time with, who were Chad, the principal, and Sarah, who is the director of the school's EL program. These two people seem like they had such a huge impact that they were really kind of holding it together for these students. And, I wonder, how can we make more educators and administrators like this? And then I also wondered, is that the right question to be asking? Can this be solved by, individuals who are just so full of heart and dedication, or, what else does that question need? I'm sorry to ask you three questions all in once, but when we look at these two individuals, how can we get more people like this in schools, and is that even the right question to be asking when it comes to how to better serve these populations?
Yeah, I think the answer is both, kind of. I mean, of course, so Chad and Sarah are incredible teachers, but they're also complicated, imperfect humans. And it felt important to me that, they were represented holistically in the book. And part of being so dedicated to these kids means shouldering a lot of really heavy stuff that they carry home with them. And you can feel how it weighs on them. Sarah's always like desperate for a smoke, and Chad starts every morning with a kind of calming ritual so he can start his day on the right foot. And you really feel how it wears them down. And, I know when like the end of the school year comes, they just turn it off for as long as they can over the summer and recharge. So, I mean, of course, having people like them in schools who kind of set this incredible standard for educating kids and working with kids is really important. But they also exist in this much bigger system that is ruled by funding and getting kids in the building in order to get funding. And so, they can't do it all alone either. And, so I guess that's why the answer is both yes and no, right? I mean, or yes, and we need teachers like that, and we need more for students. Sullivan is really lucky to have people like Chad and Sarah, and I think they attract other educators and teachers who take a similar approach. There's a trickle-down effect. But there has to be other ways to support these kids too that doesn't fall solely on an individual person.
I'm wondering if, since you finished writing the book, if there were any changes that have happened in, U.S. immigration, particularly with regard to refugees, that you think have made an important difference.
Well, just the recent announcement of the new resettlement numbers coming back up to 125,000. I mean, that's a decision that the Biden administration made, but you feel it immediately at Sullivan. I mean, there had been really no new refugees arriving at schools like Sullivan for 2 years almost. And now there are new families coming like every week. And it's incredible how acutely and how quickly that can be felt. So even though, these are decisions that are being made at the highest office, you can really feel them on the ground. So in many ways, all kinds of decisions are felt in really immediate ways at a place like Sullivan and places like Sullivan all over the country. And, the hope is that they're able to be prepared and welcome these families after this like long period of stagnancy. And in the case of Sullivan, they're ready. They're really excited. But that's because they've remained dedicated through a pretty difficult period of time.
I wanted to ask for my second to last question. After going through such a reporting project like this, you've written a whole book, and I know you're still in touch with some of the people that you wrote about, but is there a significant way that you think writing this book and reporting on these people has changed you?
I definitely think I'm a more empathetic person. I mean, I always try and come from a place of empathy, but I also feel like I got a global education by spending time, and I really, teenagers universally complain about their parents, but it always was important to me to understand their parents' perspectives too. So even in the cases where I didn't necessarily agree with choices their parents were making, I really wanted to come from a place of understanding. And I think that's a lesson I will continue to carry with me.
And to close it out, for people who hopefully have either read your book or are going to buy your book and read it and love it as much as I did, are there any other writers whose work you would also point them to?
Yeah, so some of these writers who I had on call, Alex Kotlowitz is one. His most recent book, An American Summer, came out a couple years ago, but his kind of canonical book is There Are No Children Here. I wish I was able to call Matthew Desmond, but I don't know him, but I loved his book, Evicted. I loved Beyond the Beautiful Forevers by Catherine Boo, Random Family by Adrienne LeBlanc, The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down. I always screw up that title, but Anne Fadiman's book. Those are all great, deeply narrative nonfiction books that sat on my desk the whole time I was writing.
Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing all of your experience and what this has been like. I don't know if we turn it over to Lori at this
I think
point.
so.
Hello. See, look at that. I appear when you call me. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight and sharing your just like amazing words and wisdom. And I don't know, Elly, like you bringing to life like the stories of these students that just reflect those from around the country, around the world, in all honesty, is really great to hear. So
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And thanks, Kim, for the great convo.
and of course, thank you to
Thanks for
Washington.
writing your book.
Yeah, exactly. And so, Kim, where can they catch you at?
You can find my work on the Washington Post, and you can also follow me on Twitter, where I sometimes tweet about my work and other times I tweet about food a lot. So Bellwak, Bellwak. But yeah, the Post is usually the best place to find me, and in the chats with Elly.
And then Elly, of course, where can we find you?
I'm on Twitter less than Kim, but I try. And then also my website, which is just my name, ellyfishman.com, is a great way to get in touch. And I love hearing from readers. So please do reach out. That's the most fun for me.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. And all right. Thank you all so much for tuning in tonight to Busboys and Poets Books Presents, a book talk series here at Busboys and Poets. You can go ahead and purchase Elly Fishman's book online at Eventbrite until 10 p.m. tonight. Just mosey on over, and it'll be the only option you have, so you won't miss it. We do have more events coming up this November and December. You can go ahead onto busboysandpoets.com and look for us under events. And I think that is it. Thank you all so much. Have a great evening. Peace and love.